Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for joining today's webinar titled The 411 Cybersecurity Fundamentals That Drive Infrastructure Resilience. I am Lynn Costantini, the Deputy Director of NARUC's Center for Partnership and Innovation, and I'll be the Master of Ceremonies for today's event. New slide, please. So before we begin, I just wanted to talk about a couple of housekeeping items. The first one is we have 3 presentations today, which will be followed by a question and answer period. You're all joining the webinar in listen-only mode, but you may ask a question at any time during the presentations. And there's 2 ways that you can do that. You can raise your digital hand to ask a question, or you can type your question into the chat box using the control panel on the right of your screen. That's both for the digital hand as well as the text box. We are going to hold all the questions until the presentations are over, however. So make sure if you are typing in your question to identify who you would like to direct that question to. And secondly, this webinar is being recorded and will be available for download from the CPI section of NARUC's website upon completion of the webinar. New slide, please. So at this point, I'd like to turn the microphone over to our moderator, the Honorable Jay Balaspas, Commissioner at the Washington Utilities and Transportation Commission, and the Vice Chair of NARUC's Critical Infrastructure Committee. Commissioner?
All right, thank you, Lynn, and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining today's webinar. We have a great panel of speakers this afternoon. First will be Jeff Marin from the NIST organization. Second will be Caitlin Brennan from the Edison Electric Institute, EEI. And third will be Kimberly Denbo from the American Gas Association, AGA. So I'd like to introduce Jeff as our first speaker. Jeff Marin is an IT specialist at NIST. He supports several NIST efforts, including outreach to small and medium-sized businesses, Internet of Things, and smart grid cybersecurity. He previously supported the NIST Cybersecurity Framework project, and prior to joining NIST, Jeff spent over 10 years working in IT security with the Department of Health and Human Services, and his work included implementing the risk management framework at the Food and Drug Administration, and he also spent several years at the FDA conducting security engineering and integration work. And in the more distant past, Jeff was an elementary school teacher of English as a second language in Maryland schools. So now I want to turn the microphone, and Jeff, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I appreciate that introduction, Commissioner. Thank you. Thanks for having me, and thanks for the opportunity to talk about the cybersecurity framework. You can go to the next slide, please. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about, an overview of the cybersecurity framework, including the history, a little bit of the backdrop, some components of the cybersecurity framework, how organizations can use the framework, and sort of wrap up showing some resources that organizations might find helpful in their efforts. I think it's always good to have some history, some background to understanding where a framework or some tool came from. So for the cybersecurity framework, it really began in February of 2013 when President Obama issued Executive Order 13636. It's really all about an effort to improve the cybersecurity of our nation's critical infrastructure. So it wasn't about creating new tools or new efforts. It was really about taking existing best practices, existing tools, existing methodologies, and organizing them in a way that our critical infrastructure owners and operators, most of which are private organizations, can better manage and reduce their cybersecurity risk. And that's really what it's all about, reducing risk. So like I said, it wasn't about creating anything new per se. It was just about a collaborative effort between industry, academia, federal government, any really interested parties to develop this framework. I kind of think of a framework sort of like a toolbox where organizations can take whatever tools out that they need at any particular time. And then on the right, really a law in December 2014 codifying NIST's role in continuing to advance and develop the framework over time. Next slide, please. So this slide is really just giving a flavor for who are the organizations using the framework. On the left side, we have U.S. private companies. We even have there in the second column some universities, academia. In the middle, the U.S. federal government, state governments. Then we even have international governments, international organizations, and on the far right, foreign companies. So it's really a wide, diverse group of organizations, large and small. And you can see, even though the framework was designed for critical infrastructure, lots of organizations that are not necessarily part of critical infrastructure are using and applying the framework. Next slide, please. So just to get to the heart of what is the cybersecurity framework? Well, there's really three main components to the framework. The core, which is really a catalog or a taxonomy of desired cybersecurity outcomes that an organization may want to achieve to reduce its cybersecurity risk. The second component, profile, is really taking those outcomes from the core and prioritizing them in a way that best meets the business needs or the regulatory requirements of an organization. And then the last component is the implementation tiers. Sort of a way for an organization to introspectively consider how they're managing cybersecurity risk. And I'll talk about each of these in a little bit more detail. So next slide, please. So I'll start with the implementation tiers and focusing on those three rows. First, the implementation tiers are really focusing on these three rows and sort of an organization consider how they're achieving these in their organization on a continuum from 1 to 4, 1 being sort of immature and 4 being more mature. So the first row is risk management process. Does our organization have a process in place to manage cybersecurity risk, or are we always just reacting, putting out fires as they come along? The second row, integrated risk management program. If we are managing cybersecurity risk, is our management of that risk integrated with all the other types of risk that we're managing in our organization? Or is it just siloed off maybe for the IT department or the security department to take care of and report back on a regular basis? And then thirdly, external participation. Is our organization sharing and receiving information? Do we understand where we fit in the supply chain, providing services, receiving services, maybe providing goods or receiving goods, and the risks that that might incur? And just looking at each of those on that continuum from 1 to 4. Next slide, please. The next part of the framework, as I mentioned, is the core. This is that catalog, that taxonomy of cybersecurity outcomes. And at its highest level, the framework core is organized around these 5 high-level functions of identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover. And it really covers the entire life cycle of risk management. We identify what do we need to protect. Then we put in place some safeguards to protect those assets. We detect when things go wrong. We have capabilities to respond and then to recover. But it's not linear. It's an evolving. It's a very iterative process. And the beauty about these 5 high-level functions is that these are not cybersecurity words. These are words that people from all parts of an organization, not just cybersecurity, they can understand these words. So it really helps to enable these conversations of understanding between executives who are interested in business outcomes and operations people who are thinking about, daily cybersecurity activities, really bridging that gap through this common language that both parties can understand. Next slide, please. So this slide is really just showing a lot of the same as the previous slide, but within these 5 high-level functions that I mentioned, we have different categories. You can kind of think of these categories as sort of like families of controls. Next slide, please. And this is really just digging down even a little bit further. So we have, on the far left, we have the protect function. The second column is showing that we're within the category called identity management, authentication, and access control. This is just one of those categories. And then here's where, in the third column, these subcategories, that's really where we get into the discrete outcomes that an organization may want to achieve. And you can see 2 examples here, this PR.AC-6 and PR.AC-7. It's just written in the way, it's written in an outcome sort of way. Identities are proved and bound to credentials and asserted in interactions. This is an outcome that an organization may want to achieve. It doesn't tell them how to do it. This is just an outcome. And in the far right column, those informative references, an organization can reference these controls catalogs to help them decide how they want to go about achieving the outcome. And that's really what the cybersecurity framework is all about. It's written in terms of outcomes that we want to achieve. It's what we want to achieve. It doesn't specify how we do it, because each organization is different. They may have different ways to achieve the outcomes. But next slide, please. And then the last part of the framework, which is really where the rubber meets the road, is the profile. Now, on the slides I was just showing you, those cybersecurity outcomes, the subcategories, there's 108 of those in the framework core. But they're organized according to those functions and categories. They're not prioritized in any way, because of those subcategory outcomes, some of those will be more or less important to each organization, depending on their business needs, maybe their regulatory requirements, and that's where the profile comes in. The profile is about taking those 108 subcategory outcomes and prioritizing them in a way that best meets the needs of the organization. And if you go to the next slide, this is an example. So this is one way to create a profile. In the middle, we have those 108 subcategories. They're not prioritized in the framework. An organization can take their business objectives at the top. Cybersecurity requirements could be legislation or regulations. And on the right, maybe any unique characteristics of their technical environment, maybe unique threats, maybe unique physical vulnerabilities. Maybe they operate in a very salty environment, or just something about the environment, the physical environment could cause problems for maybe operations. And using those as input to prioritize those subcategories. And that's really what the framework is all about, is it's arranging cybersecurity activities in a way that best supports business needs, business mission objectives. Okay, next slide, please. So just to wrap up some of the high-level takeaways about the framework, I know that was kind of fast, and this is just some of the key takeaways in blue here. Some of the great things we hear about the framework is it provides that common and accessible language that people from all parts of an organization can revolve around, those 5 high-level functions. It's not tied to any particular critical infrastructure sector or any particular technologies. It can be used by large organizations, small, for-profit, not-for-profit. The third point, it's risk-based. What do I mean by that? I contrast risk-based with compliance-based. So compliance-based would be a checklist that I have to do this, I have to do this, I have to do this, and just checking the boxes as I go down. But that's not what the cybersecurity framework is really all about. It's really about looking at your business mission objectives, what are your regulatory requirements, and prioritizing cybersecurity activities and outcomes in a way that best supports those needs. And each organization is different, so they're going to prioritize those cybersecurity activities and outcomes differently. It's meant to be paired. It's meant to be paired with existing controls catalog, and it's a living document. You know, the framework is going to evolve. and it's going to be updated over time. If you can, next slide, please. And here's an example. I mentioned that the original cybersecurity framework was released in February of 2014. Just last year, I think it was April of 2018, version 1.1, an update was released. And I'm not going to go through all these bullet points, but just showing how the framework will evolve over time and will be updated. And some of the big changes for version 1.1 were about managing supply chain. That's a big issue these days, is how do we manage risks from our supply chain through goods and services that we receive and supply to other organizations. And lots of language about how organizations can self-assess to monitor their progress and their needs. Next slide, please. And I'll just wrap up with some information about our website. This is kind of a, just a quick Cliff Notes run through of the cybersecurity framework. And, people might be wondering, hey, where can I go to learn some more? So if you want to get more information, you can always visit the website. It's really www.nist.gov/cyberframework. And you can see along the left, we have some, links to people who are new to framework. If you click on that, you might see some great resources, some videos to help you get some more foundational information. We have some success stories a little bit lower. We have some frequently asked questions that we've put here on the website. But what I want to show is near the bottom, resources. If you go to the next slide, please. If you click on resources, you'll be taken to a page that really can show you resources based upon categories or what you're interested in. If you click along the outside of the wheel, you'll be shown resources for each of those 5 functions of the framework that I mentioned: identify, protect, detect, respond, recover. But if you click on the middle, you'll be shown resources by different, like critical infrastructure, or if you're interested in small, medium business, or state, local, tribal, or assessment and auditing. If you go to the next slide, please. So this is showing just a little snippet from, if you click on the middle and then you go to critical infrastructure, this is just showing a snippet of what we have right now for energy sector. You can see it's a little bit lacking. It'd be great to have some more resources in here. We have resources organized by different sectors. So, one we received a couple years ago was from the Ontario Energy Board. They had a great tool that they shared with us that maybe other organizations can find useful for managing their cybersecurity risk. Next slide, please. Great, so with that, I'll wrap it up. Here's a page just showing some contact information. In the top left there, I just showed you nist.gov/cyberframework. That's where we just were. If you have any questions or want to, follow up about anything, the email in the top right, cyberframework@nist.gov, that's a great email address to use. There's a lot of people who sit behind that alias who will receive a question you have and be sure to get back with you with any answers. So with that, I'll wrap up and I'll turn it over to you, Commissioner.
All right, thank you very much, Jeff. Really appreciate that overview of the cyber framework. And so now we will hear some perspectives from the electricity and natural gas sectors. First, we'll hear from Caitlin Brennan. Caitlin is the Senior Manager for Cyber and Infrastructure Security at the Edison Electric Institute, EEI. She works with EEI member companies to address cyber and physical security threats and issues, as well as facilitating government industry coordination and collaboration. Caitlin also manages the industry Cyber Mutual Assistance Program, and previously she worked with the Department of Energy, supporting collaboration efforts with the electricity and oil and natural gas sectors, as well as the Department of Energy's emergency response and recovery capabilities. So Caitlin, I will turn the floor over to you.
Great, thank you. And thanks everyone for your time today. I'm going to give some background on how the NERC critical infrastructure protection standards in the electricity sector came about and the process of how they're developed. But first, I'll give just a quick little background on EEI for those of you who might not be familiar with our organization. Next slide, please. EEI is the trade association that represents investor-owned utilities in the U.S., investor-owned electric utilities. We're about 62 holding companies and around 100 operating companies. As you can see from this map, our members operate in all 50 states and in DC and provide electricity for about 220 million Americans. Next slide, please. So this is just a quick outline of what I'll cover today. Basically, I'll go over the who, what, when, where, why, and how of NERC SIP. So next slide, please. Diving right in, these are the major events in history that led up to the eventual NERC SIP mandatory and enforceable standards that we have today. When I refer to the NERC SIP standards, I don't mean them to be in a sense of things like the IEEE standards, but rather a mandatory regulation that has substantial fines, which could be anywhere from $1,000 to $1 million per violation per day for noncompliance. So just wanted to set that out right now before we get into the details. But in terms of the timeline, I'm going to start all the way back in 1965. There was a blackout in the Northeast U.S. that left more than 30 million people without electricity for up to 13 hours. And that was primarily in the Northeast United States, but it did also affect parts of Ontario. And after that blackout, a voluntary group of utilities who wanted to do readiness assessments to make sure something like that didn't happen again, formed the National Electric Reliability Council, also known as NARUC. So it's hard to do readiness assessments without some kind of standards to go by. So this industry group created some voluntary standards and guidelines, as well as peer evaluations and audits. And they did this for almost 40 years before the August 2003 Northeast blackout. So there was another blackout, this time that affected 10 million people in Ontario and 45 million people in the US. So this led to a multi-year blackout study to identify the causes and influencing factors that led to that blackout. And just as a side note, the actions that contributed to this blackout would likely have been assessed a high penalty in today's audit and enforcement environment. So one major blackout was bad enough, but twice definitely got the attention of Congress. So in August 2005, President Bush signed the Energy Policy Act of 2005, which included federal reliability standards for regulating the electric grid, as well as asked FERC, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, to designate an electric reliability organization. So in 2006, FERC designated NERC as the ERO, and then in 2007, NERC, which at that time was the North American Electric Reliability Council, became the North American Electric Reliability Corporation. Next slide, please. So I just wanted to spell out all of these acronyms because the relationships between these groups can be kind of confusing. And probably the best analogy that I've heard for how these groups work together is to think of it from a baseball perspective. You can think of FERC as the commissioner of Major League Baseball, NERC as the executive vice president, NERC's delegated regions as the baseball leagues, and the auditors as the umpires, with the asset owners and operators being the teams. So hopefully that helps kind of organize them in your head. And FERC is responsible for regulating interstate transmission for electricity, natural gas, and oil, and oversees NERC in the US, but is not responsible for the regulation of electric distribution, which you all know. And NERC is a not-for-profit regulatory authority and is responsible for the reliability of the grid in North America. And NERC delegates a lot of its compliance authority to the regional entities, which I'll show you on the next slide. And as we just discussed, FERC designated NERC as the ERO for the North American grid. So next slide, please. This is just a visual depiction of the regions that have delegated authority from NERC. And as you can see, Canada's power system is integrated with the US primarily in a north-south system. And then it also includes the northern part of Baja California in Mexico. Next slide, please. This is an important distinction, so I just wanted to make sure to clarify. The SIP standards only apply to the bulk electric system, which is generally all the transmission elements that operate at 100 kilovolts or higher, and does not include local distribution. There is some complicated gray space within the distinction of those two things, but as a general rule of thumb, it holds true. So next slide, please. So I've been somewhat setting the stage for what the NERC SIP standards are, but I haven't quite gotten to the point yet. So the purpose of the SIP standards is to protect the tools and technology used by the registered entity to perform obligations of the other reliability standards. And to unpack that statement, registered entity refers to how the SIP standards are applied to you based on the functions that the company performs. So companies can have multiple registrations and be responsible for several different SIP standard requirements. The second part of that sentence refers to the non-SIP standards, the other reliability standards, and that just means that SIP would not exist in a standalone environment. Without the operations and reliability related tasks of operating the grid, there would be no need for the cybersecurity protections on top of it. The SIP standards are applied in a risk-based way. So one of the first steps in SIP compliance is that companies have to categorize their bulk electric system cyber assets as either high, medium, or low impact, and that indicates which standards and requirements apply to each. And the SIP standards really provide a baseline level of security that is required by FERC to support the reliability of the grid, which helps us as an industry elevate cybersecurity across our sector. However, it is important to note that while the standards provide a foundation for our companies to build on, the SIP standards are not a silver bullet to secure against new and quickly evolving risks, and even in some places might prevent utilities from adopting new or emerging technologies, but rather they're helpful in maintaining a certain level of protection against well-known and widespread risk. Next slide, please. So in somewhat ironic timing, the NERC Board of Trustees actually had adopted a voluntary cyber standard in August 2003, one day before the Northeast blackout. And that standard eventually led to the version 1 of the NERC SIP standards. In 2003 or 2007, immediately following NERC becoming the ERO, FERC issued Order 693, which approved 83 of the 107 proposed reliability standards, which had previously been voluntary, but now became mandatory and enforceable. And those are those non-SIP standards that I just referred to. There are around 100 of these standards now, and those have in total over 1,000 requirements and sub-requirements. But as I mentioned, the applicability of those is based on your entity registrations and categorization of your assets. And those have remained relatively unchanged because they're primarily physics-based and are on things like planning, operation, and reliability of the grid. So those have not changed much since they were implemented. Alternatively, SIP version 1 was approved in 2008, and if we fast forward to 2016, we're already on SIP version 6. Version 7, and in some cases, version 8 of certain standards are also already in the works. And I wanted to highlight this to show how rapidly things change and continue to change in terms of cybersecurity of the grid. And the standards have major impacts on how our companies plan and implement their security and compliance programs. And in some cases, even just changing a definition could have major direct or indirect effects on how a company can maintain their compliance. Next slide, please. So this is a listing of all the current SIP standards. Each standard has additional requirements and subparts. You can find more details on NERC's website. And SIP 12 and 13 are in italics because they're not currently enforced, but are in the process. And you may notice that there is no SIP 001. That SIP standard has been retired because it was focused on sabotage reporting. And as you can imagine, it can be hard to determine. And so the requirements of that were rolled into other SIP standards. Next slide, please. So if you're interested in doing a deeper dive on the standards development process, you can find NERC Standards Process Manual on their website as well. The process is ANSI certified. It's a multi-step process and can take often years to complete. It's really a complex consensus-driven process that's based on a number of principles. Open participation to all entities who are materially affected by the reliability standards can participate, and each industry segment is given equal weight in determining the final outcome. NERC also distributes a notice for each action related to standards development, and the process is transparent to the public. The standards drafting teams must also give consideration to any written views or objections of all participants and respond back to each one. And there needs to be sufficient consensus to approve proposed reliability standards. So you have to have 75% of the ballot pool to meet quorum to vote on the standard, and then 2/3 of a majority to affirm it. And a major reason the standards have been so successful in providing a foundational level of security for the grid is because industry has been involved in every step of the way over the course of the history leading up to these mandatory standards. The grid is incredibly complex and takes a highly trained and skilled workforce to run. And so these subject matter experts are exactly who we have on these standards drafting teams working together to develop the standards. And there are ample opportunities for their peers throughout the process to provide formal and informal feedback and ultimately vote on those standards for approval. And once a standard is approved, it goes not only to the NERC board for adoption, but then also to FERC for approval as well. Next slide, please. So I included this slide to highlight that NERC SIP, and in particular, the SIP standards, could you go back one? The SIP standards for cyber make up just one part of our industry's approach to grid security. We focus on defense in depth and having multiple layers of security, some of which include the application of the NIST Cybersecurity Framework and other frameworks like Jeff has discussed, and then also using the best practices and guidelines that Kimberly is going to discuss next. And all of these elements are vital to protecting our industry from the threats that are out there, and the ability to adapt is crucial to continuing to address those threats as they evolve. So I'll stop here, and hopefully that helped everyone know a little bit more about NERC SIP, and I'm happy to answer any questions you might have during the Q&A.
All right, thank you very much, Caitlin. Really appreciate that presentation. And our final speaker this afternoon is Kimberly Denbo. Kimberly is the Director of Security, Operations, and Engineering Services at the American Gas Association, AGA. She has been with AGA for 20 years. Kimberly has served as staff executive for multiple AGA operating section technical committees, including the AGA Natural Gas Security Committee and the AGA board-appointed Cybersecurity Strategy Task Force. Kimberly is the industry liaison to numerous Homeland Security and Department of Energy sponsored initiatives targeting natural gas utility, physical, and cybersecurity operations. She's an active member of the Oil and Natural Gas Sector Coordinating Council, or ONG-SCC, and has served as chair of the ONG-SCC Intelligence Sharing Task Group and the Metrics Working Group. Currently, Kimberly is the chair of the ONG Pipeline and Chemical Sector Coordinating Council's Joint Cybersecurity Working Group, and she is also helping to lead the effort to ensure coordination of multiple federal government security initiatives, all designed to benefit the oil and natural gas sector. Kimberly, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Okay, so staying on this cover slide here, Lynn wanted us to have this webinar serve as a foundation of, specifically from my contribution on how your natural gas utilities may be observed addressing cybersecurity, of the significant role you play as the Public Utility Commission, and of the partnership necessary to address issues impacted by cyber vulnerabilities, including interdependencies and supply chain integrity. I have the pleasure of working closely with Department of Homeland Security and Department of Energy on such matters, and I am never shy to remind them that gas utilities must also answer to you all, the commission. The role of the Public Utility Commission cannot be discounted, especially with the authority you possess to support the utility in its development of practical, cost-effective, robust cyber programs. We can't protect everything at a heightened level for an unlimited time. Given your direct connection to the ratepayer, I believe you have the greatest appreciation for this reality. By partnering with your utility, you are in a better position to understand the cyber priorities, measures, and plans that work. For the next few minutes, I'll provide an overview of the players, the programs, and what's practical among natural gas utilities. Next slide. The American Gas Association, founded 100 years ago in 1918, represents more than 200 local energy companies that deliver clean natural gas throughout the U.S. Some statistics to intrigue you: there are more than 73 million residential, commercial, and industrial natural gas customers in the U.S., and of which 95% receive their natural gas from AGA members. Next. I wanted to share this slide with you because I think it provides a nice depiction of the 2.2 million miles of natural gas distribution pipelines in the U.S., mostly underground. Basically, you see the city gate station in the lower left-hand corner of this slide. Each one to the right-hand side of that city gate station is pretty much the utilities that report to the Public Utility Commission. So this slide, I think, is very indicative of what you all would see in your service territories. Next. I like to use the analogy of cooks in a kitchen. Multiple government agencies play a role in natural gas utility security. There are a lot of cooks in this kitchen. In addition to state public utility commissions, federal government entities include the Department of Homeland Security, the Department of Energy, and the Department of Transportation. From a federal regulatory perspective, DHS has Natural Gas Security Authority, and this authority is designated based upon the manner in which the natural gas is transported. For example, DHS Transportation Security Administration, TSA, has primary oversight responsibility for the physical security and cybersecurity of transmission and distribution pipeline systems, including natural gas distribution and liquefied natural gas, LNG facilities. The United States Coast Guard, which is the only military branch within DHS, has regulatory jurisdiction over maritime security, including LNG terminals and coastal natural gas operations. The DHS Infrastructure Security Compliance Division, ISCD, has regulatory jurisdiction over the security of stored natural gas, including underground natural gas storage, compressed natural gas, and liquefied natural gas, or LNG, as stated earlier. DOT has a role to play for multiple reasons, the leading one being that pipeline safety and pipeline security go hand in hand. And just as a little bit of knowledge, cocktail conversation, you could say, TSA actually originated from DOT until the Department of Homeland Security was stood up, and then TSA and the corresponding authorities that were with it at DOT went with TSA to DHS. DOE has a role to play because natural gas as a commodity, as the molecule, is a subsector of the energy sector. The other part of this subsector is oil and natural gas. It's oil and natural gas is one subsector. The other part of this subsector is electricity. So you take Caitlin, you take myself, and then you take our colleague from API, Suzanne Lemire, and basically you have the entire ONG and electricity subsector combined to make the energy sector. The DOE Office of Cybersecurity, Energy Security, and Emergency Response, also known as CSER, is responsible for natural gas reliability, which ties into pipeline security. Again, they go hand in hand. Further, FERC has a role to play since FERC is responsible for interstate natural gas pipeline reliability. Again, hand in hand with security. And of course, we've already discussed the role of the PUC. As I stated at the beginning of this slide, a lot of chefs in this kitchen. Next. The lead vulnerability that natural gas utilities address continues to be third-party excavation damage. Now, that aside, and focusing on security challenges, interdependencies is likely the one that looms the largest. I spoke recently at a summit that showcased electric, natural gas, telecommunications, financial, and water sectors. As soon as the topic of interdependencies was raised, fingers started pointing. I found that to be disconcerting because how can we resolve problems if we keep throwing each other under the bus? This is one area where I think the Commission can lead by example. Hosting exercises and drills of your utilities, ensuring closed-door sessions to promote candor and to dissuade the passing of judgment when certain statements or certain vulnerabilities are exposed. There's not one single entity that is without vulnerability, and not even at the state government is the government immune to cyber vulnerability. So I believe as a team, we should be helping each other through this rather than throwing each other under the natural gas bus. Supply chain integrity is a huge vulnerability, but a more complicated challenge to address. Antitrust concerns and negative publicity all fuel the fire that keeps us from tackling this at the operator level. AGA has developed cybersecurity procurement language tool to help member utilities with identifying appropriate cybersecurity language to include in procurement contracts. There are also programs led by DOE and DHS that are identifying systemic risks and vendor cyber vulnerabilities. I definitely encourage the commission to get involved with, to learn more about what DOE and DHS are doing in these areas. Now, with respect to the Internet of Things and convergence of physical and cyber, they actually also go hand in hand. As more smart grid technologies are employed and more remotely operated valves are installed, we increase the cyber attack surface to our operations. So these last two challenges, Internet of Things and convergence of physical and cyber, really could be looked at from, we put all that in to increase our reliability, but are we at the same time decreasing our resilience? Those are all the factors that need to be taken into consideration. Next. AGA has been and continues to be committed to helping AGA members elevate to a greater cybersecurity program maturity. What you see here is an excerpt of the AGA commitment to cyber and physical security. This was approved by the board, the AGA board, a couple years ago, and AGA gas utility senior executives signed a pledge to follow this commitment. If you'd like a complete copy of the commitment, I'll gladly share that with Lynn to share with you all. Next. I'm going to highlight the work AGA has been doing behind the scenes to advance cybersecurity for our member utilities and to effectuate positive change in our government. 4 items: peer cyber reviews, cyber metrics, cyber maturity assessments, and the downstream natural gas information sharing and analysis center, also known as the D&G ISAC. Back up to peer cyber reviews. This program is basically gas utility cyber professionals helping gas utility cyber professionals. AGA uses a comprehensive question set that focuses on cybersecurity of the operations network, including SCADA cybersecurity. The peer cyber reviews allow member utility cyber professionals to exchange industry practices to help gauge each other on what is a more practical practice or what might be a better practice. And it helps establish a foundation for the next initiative, which are the AGA Cyber Metrics. Cyber metrics are generated from the peer cyber reviews are intended to be used by AGA to gain a better understanding of gas utility cyber readiness. The AGA board supports the Cyber Metrics program and has the directive to all AGA member utilities to annually update their responses to the metrics. The compiled responses will help AGA identify areas of cyber strength as well as areas of cyber opportunities. The Oil and Natural Gas Cybersecurity Capability Maturity Model is ONGC2M2, and that addresses the cyber maturity assessments. This is basically, we have facilitated workshops where this particular model, we walk through it with our AGA member utilities of all sizes, and to help them assess the maturity of their cybersecurity program and where their program could advance to depending on their company's risk appetite. And last but not least, the D&G ISAC. At present, we have all AGA member utilities registered. That's over 200 member utilities registered, as well as all engagement of the INGA, the Interstate Natural Gas Association of America, transmission member companies. So that's all the gas utilities or investor-owned gas utilities, all the transmission members. And then we also have a connection with the American Public Gas Association, the MUNIs, and we have the membership of the Canadian Gas Association in the D&G ISAC, and we also coordinate closely with the Electricity ISAC and the Oil and Natural Gas ISAC, which is the upstream liquids and natural gas perspective. Next. So before I close, I wanted to leave you with some food for thought. And yes, this is pun intended since we are talking about cooks or chefs in a kitchen. As the senior chef in your state's kitchen for natural gas utility security, remember to look inward before you venture outward. For starters, keep a clean kitchen. Internal cyber hygiene is critical. Employee training on this practice is critical. And I'm talking about employees not just at the gas utilities, but I'm talking about employees in your offices as well. Just as many of us have muscle memory when donning our seat belts in our vehicles, muscle memory to think twice before clicking can be trained as well. Know the new recipes. How in tune are you with your state fusion center, your state CISO, your local FBI, your multi-state ISAC? By having the 411 directly from such sources as opposed to reading it from pop media on threats, regarding threats and targets, your conversations with your utility security professionals will be much improved. More importantly, not being swayed by sensationalized reporting, but rather being informed by credible intelligence communities will help you better understand the true impact of the malware du jour. Don't get burned. So I had one of my utility cyber gurus share a story about how the offices of his state commission were compromised by social engineering attempts. As a result, the electronic copies of some of the comprehensive regulatory documents got into the hands of the bad guys, documents that were supposed to be under virtual lock and key. These documents provided a nice roadmap for the bad guys and really laid out the utilities' cyber vulnerabilities. Now, I believe you will find that most utilities will be very open to wanting to meet, if not inviting the commission to meet with them to discuss their cyber program, their mitigation measures and whatnot. I believe a lot of times the concern will be around what leaves the office after that discussion, what written materials, what electronic materials are leaving the office after that discussion, because that's when there is no longer a control ability on the part of the operator. And so the question, it has to be begged of the commission and the commission staff is, how well can we truly protect this information? Lastly, work as a team. Even the finest chefs are better when they collaborate. Next. And with that, I'm going to close and turn this back to the commissioner.
All right, thank you very much, Kimberly, and I want to thank all three of our panelists for taking time this afternoon to share their knowledge and perspectives. I think we have a few, just a couple of minutes for maybe one or two questions. I'll ask Lynn or Carrie if we have any questions that have come in during the presentation.
This is Carrie. There have not been any questions submitted or any hands raised, but we are looking forward to them.
Okay. All right. Well, as you all on the call are thinking about a question, I do have a question for Jeff. Jeff, I want to ask, what value does the cybersecurity framework provide to utility management? And how can that framework push utilities to go beyond the minimum requirements of that framework?
Oh, sure. Well, I would say, let me get my thoughts here. I would say that as far as value to utility management, I don't think utilities are unique in that oftentimes management can see cybersecurity as just a cost, sort of like a cost negative, and I think many executives have trouble seeing how the money they're spending on cybersecurity has any relevance or helps the organization in any way. And I think one of the nice things about the cybersecurity framework is it's really all about tying cybersecurity activities and those outcomes to business objectives. So I think it provides that nice tie-in where the executives can see, hey, this is what we're doing to achieve this outcome. These are the cybersecurity activities we're engaging in, and these are the business objectives that we're supporting or providing value to or protecting in some cases by engaging in these activities. And then as far as like how it helps to go past the minimum, of course, there's nothing wrong with minimums. It's good to have baselines. I mean, like NERC CIP, those are all great things. NERC CIP's not going to be going away. And I think I mentioned during my talk that when we have those 108 subcategories that we prioritize in a profile, of course, we have to consider these baselines. We have to consider regulatory requirements. We want to really bake those into our prioritization. So we take those our business mission objectives, of course, any regulatory requirements we have, and go through that prioritization activity. So I think the act of tying it to business objectives and business activities really helps to go beyond the minimum, because we're looking at what in our organization needs to be protected, which I think in itself goes beyond the minimum in that regard. So I hope that answers the question.
No, that does. Thank you. Thank you very much, Jeff. Appreciate that. And then, Kimberly, you kind of touched on this in your presentation about the role of state commissions, but I want to ask both you, Kimberly, as well as Caitlin, what can we as regulators and public utility commissions encourage that culture of continuous improvement and going above and beyond just sticking to a framework, whether that's a mandatory framework or a voluntary framework?
So Kimberly here. I think the main thing to bear in mind is to always remember that there is not one size or one solution for every utility, and not even one type of solution for all natural gas utilities. So I think it's the flexibility, which is why every time I speak, I'm always talking about the commissions and the utilities having conversations. And that's why the more educated both sides can get, which means a requirement on the part, or a dedication and commitment on the part of the commission to get cyber smart, to be able to have those conversations with the utilities, which is why I also love the NARUC primer, cybersecurity primer, because I think that asks the right questions. Now, the utility may not always have the answer that the commission is wanting to hear, but the truth is, once you have that conversation, then you can start driving towards a resolution. Caitlin?
Yeah, thanks, Kimberly. I would agree with Kimberly's statement as well as say that my members and Kimberly's members and the industry in general, our main goal and purpose is to provide service to our customers. So we want the same thing as the PUCs, reasonably priced, reliable service for our customers. And the partnership that Kimberly talked about now and in her presentation is so important. And we know that our members can be sensitive about sharing security documents, and there are reasons behind that, but they are very open to dialoguing with you and having you come and visit facilities and having conversations to make sure that that everyone is on the same page about the security practices in place and making sure that there is that level of security to the service. And so I would really encourage everyone to reach out to their utility and ask to have conversations and go visit their facilities and see what practices and measures are in place in terms of cybersecurity for their systems.
Great, thank you both.
Commissioner, I would also strongly encourage, NARUC is so fortunate now to have Lynn Constantini on staff because she brings a wealth of cybersecurity program knowledge and strategy to the table. And so I think more programs that can be developed through her, through NARUC, with the input of multiple states or perspectives from multiple states, multiple commissions. I think that way you can really get a good handle on what each other is doing, as well as how we can just move each other, advance each other as a group.
That's great. No, I appreciate that, Kimberly. I wholeheartedly agree with that. Seeing that we're coming up on the top of the hour, I will turn this back over to Lynn and thank NARUC for hosting the webinar here.
Thank you. And Kimberly, I am blushing. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you to each of our presenters. Not to put too fine a point on it, I think each of our presenters really addressed a very specific, fundamental aspect of cybersecurity. Jeff certainly addressed frameworks. Frameworks is like a building, the framing of a house, for example. It allows you to organize your cybersecurity priorities and your cybersecurity risk management efforts. Without following a framework, chaos might just ensue. Caitlin introduced us to the concept of mandatory standards, regulatory standards, I think she characterized them as, and I'm going to steal that from you, Caitlin. Those mandatory standards provide accountability for taking very particular, defined actions to mitigate perceived cyber risk. And as she said, it provides a baseline or a floor of security. And the electric sector is not the only sector that has mandatory standards. We have HIPAA in healthcare, we have PCI in the credit card processing industry, and those mandatory standards serve the same purpose. They provide that baseline of performance. And then Kimberly really addressed best practices and how best practices can push beyond a floor to strive to reach a ceiling. And I loved her analogy about getting all of the cooks in the kitchen aligned so they don't damage each other with knife cuts. She talked about procurement language. She talked about peer reviews. They're all aspects of best practices that drive toward optimizing risk management, not just meeting compliance benchmarks. But the point is that all three combined are really what provide that foundational cybersecurity practice that, as Kimberly noted, will advance us all. And I ask that you remember these foundational concepts, as I do plan to conduct additional cybersecurity webinars later in the year that will delve more deeply into specific cybersecurity topics. So with that, if you would move to the last slide. The next two NARUC CPI sponsored webinars will not be on cybersecurity topics, but they will be on innovation topics nonetheless. The next one is scheduled for July 15th. We're going to be talking about carbon capture and tax credits. And then the next one is August 15th. We're going to be talking about grid valuation frameworks, really interesting topics that I encourage you all to join in. And the registration link is right there on that slide. Lastly, as I mentioned in the very beginning, the presentations they have been recorded and they will be posted on the NARUC website at that very same link. Feel free to download them at your leisure. If you have ideas for other cybersecurity webinars that you would like to hear, certainly drop me an email. It's lcostantini@naruc.org. I do again want to extend NARUC's thanks to our presenters, Jeff, Caitlin, and Kimberly, as well as to our moderator, Commissioner Balasbas. With that, if there are no other questions, we'll end the webinar. Thank you all.